English 2322 audio lecture, Dr. Faustus and the Morality Play Tradition. In our discussion of medieval drama, I mentioned that scholars tend to place medieval plays into one of two categories. The largest category consists of biblical cycle plays, sometimes called mystery plays, and this is the category that the Second Shepherd's Play falls into, and you can review the materials for a definition of that genre. But the other category, and this is a category we didn't look at specifically, is a category usually referred to as morality plays. Morality plays, though they're not maybe as important for our understanding of medieval drama, they're really important for our understanding of later drama because of the impact that morality plays had on the development of drama, specifically in the English Renaissance. And understanding a play like Dr. Faustus specifically, I think is a lot easier if we have a basic understanding of what morality plays were like. I'm going to talk a little bit about medieval morality plays then. Now, like the cycle plays, morality plays were originally religious in nature. But rather than being about biblical history in the life of Christ, like the cycle plays are, morality plays tended to focus on the battle between good and evil that played out in each individual person's life. These plays, in other words, were usually allegories. An allegory is a symbolic work of literature in which the characters and the plot and other details represent larger or more general ideas. Maybe the best way to understand what allegory is like is to look at one particular morality play, probably the best known of all the medieval morality plays, which is a play called Everyman. Now, as you can tell from the title of the play, this is a play about ordinary people. We still have this term, everyman. We'll describe certain maybe actors as being an everyman. In other words, they seem like ordinary people, just like an ordinary guy. So in this play, the main character is named Everyman, and obviously he represents people in general. And in the play, Everyman meets a character named Death, who tries to take him to heaven. Everyman asks permission to take a companion with him, and then spends most of the play looking for a companion. And the characters that he approaches to ask to go with him have names that demonstrate their symbolic nature. Their names are things like knowledge or kindred or good deeds. And at the end, good deeds is the only character that accompanies Everyman to heaven. Now, obviously, you can't read a play like Everyman literally. It has to be interpreted symbolically. Everyman can't be an individual. He's representative of all people. And even the situation isn't meant to be realistic. It's not really the story of one person's death, but rather it's a story about the death of all people. The idea that death does come to all people, and that when it does, things like wealth and knowledge and family will pass away, and that the only thing that will benefit a person are the good works that were performed in his or her lifetime. There are other morality plays written in the medieval period with titles like Mankind or The Castle of Perseverance, and again, you can tell from the titles that they follow a similar pattern and make similar points about the importance of living a moral life. Morality plays were popular throughout the 15th century especially, but they continued to be written and performed at least into the late 16th century. In other words, during the time that playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, and even, by the way, William Shakespeare, were alive. And so those plays almost certainly would have been familiar to somebody like Marlowe, and almost certainly would have had some kind of influence on the way he thought about drama. I think we can see the influence of the morality play genre in Dr. Faustus pretty easily. Most obviously, we have a lot of allegorical characters in the play. So the good and bad angels, for example, that show up in the play are very kind of typical characters for a morality play. Even the seven deadly sins, who make a brief appearance in the play as characters, these were figures that showed up actually in several medieval morality plays, and Marlowe may have taken the idea of having the seven deadly sins show up as characters directly from a morality play that he may have been familiar with. But maybe the biggest similarity between Dr. Faustus and medieval morality plays is the kind of point that the play makes. In other words, Dr. Faustus unquestionably has a moral purpose, that the play, rather, has a moral purpose, not the character. The play makes a point about the importance of devoting your life to God, of living a virtuous life, of avoiding pride and excess, etc. And these are the same kinds of points that medieval morality plays would have made. So it's tempting, I think, to see Dr. Faustus as sort of the logical outgrowth of the morality play tradition. But there are some problems with treating Dr. Faustus as a morality play. Most of the characters in the play, for example, are not allegorical figures. Though the good and bad angels are there and the seven deadly sins are there, the other characters are individuals. And that really points to one of the biggest issues with thinking of this play as a morality play. Morality plays, by definition, aren't about individual people. Rather, they're about humanity and the kinds of problems that humanity overall faces. But this play is about an individual. It's about one guy, Dr. Faustus, and he's sort of an extraordinary guy. He's not an everyman at all. He's the smartest man in Europe, basically. He's a guy who's striving for absolute power, and that makes him not very typical as the protagonist of a morality play. And it may be that we can see a more sort of basic problem with thinking of this play as a morality play by just looking at the title of the play, the title that Marlowe gave the play, The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. That term tragical history suggests maybe that Marlowe thought of the play as more of a tragedy than a morality play. Now, tragedies, and this is a term you're probably a little more familiar with because you've almost certainly had some exposure to the concept of tragedy in literature, whether in high school or in earlier college-level literature classes. But the idea of tragedy is a very old literary idea. It had been around certainly since at least the ancient Greek period. And in the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote what became sort of a definition of tragedy. Now, Aristotle was talking about a particular approach to tragedy that was popular in ancient Greece, but his ideas became standard for the next, well, at least 2,000 years, so that authors like Marlowe and later Shakespeare were familiar with Aristotle's ideas and structured tragedies around those ideas. And the way Aristotle thinks of a tragedy is basically that it has to focus on a character's reversal of fortune. In other words, the character has to fall from some level of greatness. The character can't be oppressed throughout the play. He, for Aristotle, would have been a male. He has to either rise to some great height or start from some great height. And then the character has to suffer a pretty significant reversal of fortune. And that reversal of fortune has to be due to a flaw in the character himself. The word that Aristotle uses, the Greek word, is hamartia. But we use the word tragic flaw, and this is usually a character flaw, sometimes a mistake in judgment that a character makes. But the key is that it has to be the hero's own fault. That is what makes a tragic hero, in fact. The hero has to fall because of some flaw in his character. Now, part of the definition of a tragic hero almost certainly applies to Faustus. He definitely suffers a pretty significant fall, a reversal of fortune. He goes from having all the power that he could ever want in the universe to being torn apart by devils, essentially. But there is a real question there, and I think hopefully you've gotten to the end of the play, so you hopefully have thought about this question a little bit. The question of to what degree Faustus's fall is his own fault. Now, let me explain. Some of you probably are objecting to even my hesitation here, because certainly Faustus gets what he asks for. He sells his soul to the devil for absolute power, and as a result of making that deal, he is consigned to hell. And so on that level, he exercised free will. He did it knowingly. He wasn't tricked into selling his soul, and he is therefore responsible for what happens to him. And it's significant here that the good angel specifically tells Faustus repeatedly in the play that he has the ability to change things, that he can turn away from the deal, he can turn back to God, and everything will be fine. And Faustus doesn't. So if we look at the play that way, certainly Faustus, because maybe of his arrogance or his desire for power, we can think of those as tragic flaws, he makes his own bed. In other words, he creates the problems that lead to his fall. But I'm not sure that's the way Marlowe wants us to think about Faustus' situation. Because Faustus isn't making a deal with an equal at the beginning of the play. In other words, Faustus, though he is supposedly this really smart guy, although I think we can see ways in which he's really foolish also, Faustus is entering into a negotiation with an entity that by definition is much, much more powerful and much more knowledgeable than he is. And I think we have to ask whether Faustus really gets a fair deal. You know, what Faustus wants is ultimate knowledge and power. And he's willing to sell his soul for a period of having that knowledge and power. But I'm not sure Faustus ever really gets that knowledge and power. It's interesting, for example, to look at the things that Mephistopheles refuses to do for Faustus. In fact, in Mephistopheles' first scene, Faustus says, "I charge thee to wait upon me whilst I live, to do whatever Faustus shall command." And Mephistopheles immediately responds, "I serve Lucifer, not you. I can only serve you if Lucifer allows me to." And so Mephistopheles starts out by showing Faustus that he doesn't really have power over Mephistopheles. And then later Mephistopheles demonstrates those limitations on several occasions. One of Faustus's first requests of Mephistopheles is to produce a wife for him. And Mephistopheles basically says he can't produce a wife. Later, Faustus asks Mephistopheles to tell him who created the universe. And Mephistopheles says, "I will not." So here are some examples of the limitations of the deal that Faustus has made. He's sold his soul for unlimited knowledge and power, but what we're shown several times is the limits on the knowledge and power that he's given. In fact, when we look at Faustus, even after he has received the power that Mephistopheles confers, he doesn't really seem more powerful than he was before. Certainly he can do what we call magic, but the magic tricks that he does, he can be invisible, he kind of plays with the Pope's food, he tricks a horse trader out of $40, but these are pretty minor feats for who is this guy who is supposedly the most powerful man in the universe. And once we look at those examples, I think we have to question whether Faustus's fall is entirely his fault or whether he's been manipulated to some degree by the devil. And certainly that manipulation would fit in with Renaissance ideas of the devil. The devil was somebody who would trick you at all costs, somebody who could not be trusted. And so the question of whether Faustus's downfall is because of a tragic flaw in his character or because he was foolish enough to try to make a deal with somebody like the devil, and therefore the devil bears some of the responsibility, I think that raises questions about whether we should think of this play as a tragedy or not. In fact, the question of Faustus's culpability in the play really determines whether we think of this play as a morality play or a tragedy. If he's entirely culpable, it's a tragedy. But if this is a play about the dangers of evil in the universe, then it's kind of like a morality play, because although Faustus is an extraordinary figure, the danger that he faces, the manipulation that the devil represents, is the kind of danger that all people face in the medieval worldview. Really, the question of whether we think of the play as a morality play or a tragedy is kind of related to whether we think of it as a play sort of at the end of the medieval period, and certainly we break the medieval period around 1500, so technically this play would be written after the medieval period. But as I said, morality plays certainly were still being performed at this time. Whether we think of this as sort of the end of the morality play tradition, or we think of it as sort of an early modern play, a play that's more typical of the period that we call the Renaissance, the 16th and 17th century especially. Because one of the big differences between the medieval worldview and the Renaissance worldview has to do with the emphasis on the individual. The medieval worldview is much less concerned with the individual. And this goes way back to our discussion of, for example, round and flat characters. A lot of characters in medieval literature are not meant to be individual in the modern sense. They're meant to be representative of a group or a type. And morality plays are the most blatant example of that. So characters don't even have individual names. They're just mankind or everyman. But the Renaissance was much more focused on the individual. And so when Shakespeare writes a play like Hamlet, Hamlet's troubles are about Hamlet. They're not about humankind in general. I mean, we can maybe all relate to Hamlet on some level, but he's definitely an individual character with a personality and with a backstory, with a psychology. And it's his individuality, his Hamletness, in other words, that we really admire about that character and about that play. So we have to figure out where we're going to put Dr. Faustus. Is it more of a medieval play, more of an early modern play, or is it, in fact, somewhere in between? Maybe this is the most productive way of thinking about the play. I think that it sort of stands on a border between the sort of late medieval ideas about drama and the individual and early modern ideas about drama and the individual. It's really more modern than a morality play, but in some ways it's less modern than the plays of Shakespeare, which will be written around the same time as Marlowe or within a decade or two after Dr. Faustus was written. So this is one reason why this play is really interesting, because it does show us both elements of the past in dramatic tradition and some kind of inkling of the future of what drama is going to be like very, very soon. If you have any questions about these ideas or about the play itself, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thanks.